start the conversation about the overall definition of what popular culture and culture is, and how are we going to talk about it for the rest of the semester. So let's start with the first slide. Overall, what do we call pop culture and where it began? How do we define what's popular culture and what's traditional culture? Well, as a phenomenon, scholars and overall mass media practitioners started talking about the existence of pop culture as a lifestyle and its roots in the 1920s. And it's pretty interesting because this coincided with the proliferation of the first mass media. Of course, if we don't talk about books and newspapers that existed before, but in the 1920s, more and more households were able to afford a radio, and that became the very first step in the technological evolution that led to the current media system that we're living in now. Just one quote from Marcel Denisy, a scholar that works a lot researching popular culture and culture in particular. He said that pop culture has become an unconscious driving force behind social, economic, and even political change. So Denisy believes that a lot of changes that we see in the society actually have their roots in popular culture. A lot of those social norms that we accept or don't accept, again, can be related to what we see in cultural products or the results of artistic creation. So popular culture is inevitably connected to all of those areas of the society's life, may it be social, economic, or political. And that's what we're going to explore this whole semester, trying to define this connection between popular culture and different areas of the society's life. So moving on to the next slide. Let's define culture first and then move on to pop culture as a term. Culture can be defined as a means of organizing and stabilizing communal life and everyday activities through specific beliefs, rituals, rites, performances, art forms, symbols, language, clothing, food, music, dance, and other human expressive, intellectual, and communicative pursuits and faculties that are associated with a group of people at a particular period of time. So here we have three important main elements of this definition. Well, first of all, culture defines a particular period of time. So we can talk about the culture of the 20th century, the culture of the 19th century, and so on. But more so than that, culture also defines a particular group of people. So if we talk about the ancient Greek culture, it unites people that lived in ancient Greece during a certain period of time. And then on top of that, look how many different expressions culture can take, how many different forms. Anything from art symbols or language or food or music or even clothing. And we'll talk a lot about this, that even things we use in our daily life are a part of our culture. So when archaeologists find some ancient artifacts, even things that people used to use in their daily lives, like their clothing or buildings that they used to build, it all communicates different elements of their culture. And that's pretty interesting because we don't think about a lot of elements surrounding us in such a way. We don't think of them as cultural artifacts. But in fact, they do communicate our culture and the culture of our time period. So saying that, let's move on to the next slide. Ancient Greeks distinguished between high culture and low culture. And we can see this distinction in multiple different eras of time. So what is high culture and what is low culture, and who decides that it's such? Low culture is often seen as recreational and superficial. And that's one common feature that you can see when scholars and ancient philosophers talk about what's considered low-level art and high-level art. And then high culture is usually considered to have a more profound influence on the history of human civilization. So to summarize that categorization or this dichotomy, we can say that high culture, it's usually something that is significantly more important than just entertainment. It's usually some art piece that has some artistic value, but on top of that, it also influences the history of human civilization, compared to low culture that has a very short lifespan and is aimed at just providing some recreation and entertainment. So let's move on to the next slide. Technology. One of the key elements, pretty much the key ingredient in this recipe that led us to the creation of popular culture. Again, you remember that in the beginning of today's conversation, we mentioned that the term pop culture wasn't really in use until the 1920s. And it coincided with the, if not proliferation, at least the first steps of humanity toward using technology in everyday life, especially mass media. Of course, people had mass media like newspapers previously, but starting with the 1920s, pretty much every decade or two, a new invention was introduced into our everyday life that allowed people to enjoy culture the ways they've never seen before. So in the 20s, people started using radio. And that's when we start talking about the birth of pop culture. And then in the 40s, more and more households, and especially in the 50s, can finally afford a TV set. So we start talking about television culture and visual culture. And we'll talk more about this later in this semester, but in particular, it's interesting how the more advanced television technology became, the more detailed the movies became. So, for example, first TV sets that had tiny little screens, they weren't really capable of transmitting the image in such detail, so people couldn't really see a lot of facial features of actors on the screen. And as a result, the actors creating those black and white movies that had no sound, on top of that, they also had to do really strange makeup to make sure that people that watched that movie with really bad quality on a tiny screen can actually see what the person looks like, where are the eyes, and overall what the actor is doing on the screen. And of course, now with modern television technology and the quality of TV sets, you can see all the small details, and plus you have all kinds of computer graphics elements in movies. So the quality of production actually led to a paradigm shift when it comes to artistic ideas. The more technological advancements you have, the more freedom you have to express your artistic idea, the way you see it, the way you can vision it as an artist. So interestingly, such a non-cultural thing as technology actually played a dramatic role in the history of human culture. Another one is business. And the business side of it has often been criticized by a lot of scholars, which is what we're going to talk about during week 2. But also, if we think about it, technology, business, and art have always walked hand in hand throughout history, trying to create something new. And so technology and business, these are some of the major causes of cultural revolutions. And essentially, economy is actually a huge driving force behind cultural development, especially if we talk about pop culture, not traditional culture. Essentially, just because the more people can buy, the higher is their buying power, the more new things they will seek. And the more they will seek, the more they're likely to consume new content. So of course, for pop culture, audiences' buying power and the overall profitability of economy is a very significant force. Saying that, let's move on to the next slide. An additional definition of culture that I've also found pretty interesting defines this term as a system of symbolic and expressive structures that a particular group of people develops and utilizes to enhance solidarity, understanding, and transmission of knowledge. That's an interesting definition because it says nothing about traditional forms of art the way we see them, but instead, it actually enhances culture as this unifying element that highlights solidarity, understanding, and transmission of knowledge between people. That's a very different angle that we can take a look at culture from. And I just wanted to include this definition to illustrate that there are many different ways to look at culture as a phenomenon. Let's move on to the next slide. Cultural relativism. So we just spoke about how culture unifies people and also gives them the sense of solidarity and understanding, also to some extent the sense of belonging. This leads us to the idea of cultural relativism. That's the theory that was created by Franz Boas, and the basic idea of this theory was that culture shapes how we perceive reality, which sends us back to that definition we just took a look at, that says that culture highlights our solidarity and transmission of knowledge. Some examples. Smile is interpreted differently in different cultures. In certain cultures, smile is not interpreted as much of a friendly gesture, and people find it somewhat odd. And there are a lot of jokes that are based on that are partially true as well. So for example, when I lived in Russia, it wasn't that common for people around me to smile, so I didn't smile as much either. But then when I moved here, I found out that here, a smile is a common way to express just how generally polite you are. So people use it in business meetings. When they greet their coworkers, their smile. Usually in Russia, I would probably never smile to my supervisor at work or my editor because it would seem unprofessional and not serious. But here people use smiles all the time because it's a common element of local culture. And it's pretty interesting because if you take a look at history when world's communities were significantly less connected, there was no technology to connect them, those differences are even bigger, which makes the theory of cultural relativism even more applicable. Another example, how are you in Europe and America actually has a slightly different meaning. Here it pretty much means, hi, I see you, what's up? But in Europe, if someone asks you, how are you, they actually want to start a conversation and they want to hear everything about your life. They're actually trying to start that type of conversation. Here, if you ask someone, how are you, while you're in a rush trying to get a cup of coffee in the morning going to work, obviously you don't expect them to start an hour-long deep conversation about all their life circumstances. So that's, again, differences in culture. So there's multiple different traditions, different ways people look at the same exact things. And that's what cultural relativism tries to explain. The basic idea here is that the culture that we grew up around defines how we interpret certain things. So if you grew up in a society that really values individualism and personal freedom, you will have certain values and views. But if you grew up in a society that values common structures, that values communal values over personal freedom and individuality, you might find out that those values are actually turned upside down for you. You might have very different opinions on what is good versus what is bad for you or the society. And that's what cultural relativism attempts to explain.